This is a work of pure cinematic fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and organizations depicted are entirely fictional and invented for this story alone. The night Eli Carter almost died, not a single person on that street looked up from their phone. He was 12 years old, 63 pounds of hunger and scar tissue, sleeping in doorways and eating whatever the city forgot to throw away. Nobody knew his name. Nobody wanted to. That was the deal you made with the streets. You became invisible, and in exchange, the streets let you survive one more night. Eli had kept that deal for 2 years without breaking it once, until the little girl screamed, and now he was on his knees in a frozen alley behind the Rusty Nail Diner, one eye already swelling shut, tasting copper on his tongue, with 3 teenagers who outweighed him by a combined 200 pounds, deciding whether they were finished with him yet. They weren't. Before you find out whether Eli makes it out of that alley, subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happens next in that alley, what roars through that frozen dark from 6 blocks away, is going to stay with you for a long time. The cold that night was the kind that didn't announce itself. It didn't howl or blow. It simply settled into everything. The cracked asphalt, the chain-link fences, the hollow bones of a 12-year-old boy who hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days. Millhaven in January was a gray, forgotten city. The kind of place that looked better in photographs taken from a moving car because you couldn't smell it, and you couldn't feel the particular way the wind moved through its empty lots like it was searching for something it already knew wasn't there. Eli Carter knew every block of the east side by the way it smelled. The stretch near the bus depot smelled like diesel and burnt coffee. The underpass on Callahan Avenue smelled like mildew and the ghost of 100 campfires. The alley behind the Rusty Nail Diner smelled like old grease and the cold metal of dumpsters that had been rained on too many times. He'd been sleeping near that diner for 6 nights straight. Not inside. Never inside. The owner, a thick-necked man named Gus, had made that clear the first time Eli tried the back door. Gus had a face that looked like it had been stepped on and a voice that matched, and what he said to a starving 12-year-old standing in his kitchen doorway wasn't worth repeating, but the message was clean. You are not welcome here. You are not my problem. Get out of my sight. Eli had gotten out of his sight. That was how the city worked. You learned the language fast, or the city taught it to you in ways that left marks. The language was simple. It was always some variation of, not my problem, not my kid, not my block, not my alley, move along. He'd learned to move along. He had a system. There was a heating grate on Mercer Street where the air came up warm from somewhere underground, and on the worst nights he slept on that. He had a garbage bag folded into a pad, a second one he wore over his jacket when it rained, and a wool blanket he'd found behind a Salvation Army drop box that still smelled faintly of someone's grandmother. He kept his shoes tied tight, always, because the one time he'd loosened them, a man had tried to take them off his feet while he slept. He was 12 years old, and he already understood that the world was full of people who would take from you the moment you relaxed. That Friday night, he was moving back toward the Mercer Street grate when he heard it. Not the scream first, the scream came a second later. What he heard first was the sound of a backpack being thrown, the zipper catching on something, and the scatter of small objects across wet pavement, a constellation of small plastic things, a stuffed bear, a coloring book fanning open in the gutter. And then the laugh. That specific kind of teenage laugh that is not about anything being funny. Eli stopped. The alley ran behind the Rusty Nail and cut through to the parking lot of an abandoned check-cashing place. It was the kind of space that didn't belong to anyone on paper, which meant it belonged to whoever was willing to be there at night. 3 of them. 2 boys, 1 girl, all of them older. 16, maybe 17, the age where some kids still looked like children and some had already crossed some invisible line into something harder to name. These 3 had crossed it. You could see it in the way they stood, the economy of their cruelty, how they didn't hurry because they didn't need to. The little girl in the center of them was maybe 6 or 7, wearing a puffy pink coat that was too bright for this alley. A coat that said someone loved her, someone had picked it out for her, someone who was not here right now. Her pigtails were coming undone. Her face was wet, tears and snot mixed together, the specific devastation of a small child who has understood suddenly that she is alone with people who mean her harm. "Give us the bag," one of them said, not yelling. That was the part that made Eli's stomach tighten. People yelled when they were uncertain. This boy was not uncertain. "The whole bag, and whatever else you got." I don't have anything," the little girl said. Her voice was doing that fragmented thing voices did when a person was trying very hard not to completely come apart. "I'm waiting for my dad. He's coming. He's right. He's not here, though," the girl in the group said and smiled. Eli stood at the mouth of the alley. He could feel the cold through his shoes, through the 2 pairs of socks he wore layered. He was 63 pounds. He knew what he looked like. He knew what he was. He'd gotten beaten before. A lot, actually. And he knew exactly what his body could absorb and what it couldn't, and his brain was doing that fast, cold math it always did in situations like this, running the numbers on survival. The numbers said, "Walk away." He'd walked away before. He was not a hero. He'd never called himself one. Survival required that you assessed your resources honestly, and his resources were negligible. He was a hungry kid in a bad alley with no phone, no backup, no one on earth who would notice if he got hurt. The numbers said he was irrelevant to this situation. The numbers said, "Keep moving, find the great, get warm, survive one more night." He stood there and watched the little girl try to back away from them, and watched one of the boys reach out and grab the collar of her pink coat, and the numbers stopped mattering. He walked into the alley. "Hey," he said. His voice came out smaller than he wanted it to. It didn't matter. All 3 of them turned, took him in, took in the patched jacket, the hollow face, the split lip he'd been carrying since Tuesday. And he watched the calculation happen behind their eyes. The same calculation he'd just been running, but reversed. He was small. He was alone. He was, to them, nothing. "Get out of here," the boy holding the girl's collar said, almost bored. "Let her go," Eli said, a beat. Then the tallest one, who had barely moved until now, stepped forward. He had a good 4 inches and maybe 60 pounds on Eli, and he had the particular confidence of someone who had never once in his life lost a fight because he'd never had to. "Last time," the first boy said. "Walk away." Eli looked at the little girl. She was looking at him the way people look at things they aren't sure are real. He didn't look like help. He knew that. He probably looked like another problem. "I can't do that," he said. What happened next was not clean. It was not cinematic in the way fights look in movies, with clear pauses and space to breathe and someone always saying the right thing. It was fast and ugly, and it hurt immediately. The tall one hit him twice in the face before Eli even had his hands up, and the ground came up too fast, and his shoulder took the pavement hard and sent a shock up through his collarbone that made his whole right arm go briefly numb. He got up. Not because he had a plan, not because he thought he was going to win. He got up because the little girl was still standing there, and getting up was the only thing he knew how to do. "Still here," he said. His mouth was bleeding. He could feel it. The tall one hit him again. The alley tilted. He put one hand on the dumpster and pushed himself back to his feet, and he moved back to the space between the boys and the girl, and he planted his feet on the greasy, wet asphalt, and he stayed there. He took 3 more hits, each one a specific piece of his body deciding to stop cooperating. His left knee buckled, his vision went white at the edges, something in his midsection screamed every time he inhaled. He went down twice more. Both times he came back up, slow and shaking, and returned to that same spot, between the boys and the girl. "Get to her," he said finally, and his voice was barely audible. "You have to get through me." He didn't know why he said it. It felt like something he'd been carrying a long time without knowing it. Some small, hard thing he'd swallowed when he was younger, before everything happened, when someone used to stand between him and the dark. That person was gone now, had been gone a long time. But the shape of what they'd given him, that willingness to be the thing standing in the way, that was still there. The tall boy was staring at him with an expression that had shifted, not mercy. Something more unsettled than that. He wasn't done. But something in the scenario had changed, and he hadn't caught up to it yet. The little girl was crying hard now, silent, heaving sobs, her face buried in her hands. And through the blood collecting in his left eye, Eli could see her shaking, and he thought, "Don't look at me. Look at the fence. Think about getting over the fence." He wanted to tell her that, but he didn't have enough air for it. The tall boy grabbed him by the jacket and lifted him, literally lifted him. and for a moment Eli was looking down at the pavement from an extra foot of height, and everything was very clear and very cold, and he thought, okay, that's as far as I go. The sound came from everywhere at once. Not a sound, actually. A vibration. Something that started in the soles of your feet and moved upward through your spine before your ears could even process what it was. The alley walls seemed to absorb it, seemed to hold it, seemed to throw it back doubled and then doubled again. Engines. Dozens of them. Eli felt the boy's grip loosen before he heard the boots on the pavement at the alley entrance. He registered the headlights before he registered anything else. That specific white-yellow glare of motorcycle lights. Not one, not two, a wall of them, turning the alley entrance into something that looked like a tear in the dark, like whatever was behind the night was finally showing through. The tall boy set him down, slowly. From the alley entrance, framed in that impossible backlit brightness, stood a man. He was not a large man in the way people use the word large to mean fat or bulky. He was large the way certain things in nature were large, the way a cliff face was large, the way a storm was large. It was a quality of presence more than dimension, something that occupied space and made the space behave differently. He wore a cut with patches that Eli couldn't read from here, jeans dark with grease and road, boots that had clearly been worn in weather that would have ended most people. He had a face that had been broken and put back together, not always correctly, with a jaw like poured concrete and eyes the specific dark gray of the sky right before hail. He didn't move fast. He didn't shout. He just walked in. And every single person in that alley, including the 3 teenagers, including Eli himself, immediately understood that the situation had fundamentally changed. The man crouched in front of the little girl first. He touched her face, both hands, checking her the way a person checked something they were terrified to find broken. His voice, when he spoke to her, dropped to something barely audible. Eli couldn't hear the words. What he heard was the register of it, that bottomless, careful tone you used when you were holding yourself together through willpower alone, because falling apart was not an option when someone needed you to be solid. The girl said something, one word. Then she reached up and locked both arms around the man's neck. He closed his eyes. Just for a second. Just long enough for Eli to see, in that brief collapse of the man's face, the specific kind of terror that had been running through him for however long his daughter had been missing. And then the face went solid again, and the eyes opened and the gray gaze moved deliberately across the alley. Landed on the 3 teenagers. The tall one said something. He said it in the voice people used when they were trying to sound like they hadn't already completely lost the situation. Something about how they weren't doing anything, how it was a misunderstanding. The man in the cut said nothing. Behind him, more of them had entered the alley. Eli lost count. 10, 12, more. Big men, quiet men, men with road dust on their jackets and faces that had all clearly sat with difficult things long enough that difficult things no longer surprised them. They arranged themselves not in an aggressive formation, but in a simple, complete way. They were simply everywhere, all the exits, all the angles, without anyone seeming to direct it. One of the younger bikers crouched beside Eli, where he'd ended up against the dumpster, sliding down it when his legs stopped working. The young man had a close-cropped beard and a scar along his jawline, and he smelled like engine grease and cold air, and he said, in a voice that was remarkably neutral, "Hey, you good?" Eli tried to answer. What came out was not particularly coherent. "Yeah," the young man said, not unkindly. "Okay, we got you." Eli looked up at him. He had a very specific policy about accepting help from strangers. It was not a generous policy. 2 years on the street had calcified it into something close to instinct. Help from strangers had a price. Everything had a price. The world had been extremely consistent about teaching him that. But the young man wasn't waiting for an answer, and wasn't demanding one, and wasn't positioning himself to extract anything. He just put one hand on Eli's shoulder, carefully, clearly feeling the flinch before it happened, and adjusting, and held him steady. The man with the gray eyes was still looking at the 3 teenagers. The tall one had stopped talking. "Who are you?" The man's voice, when he finally used it on them, was not raised. It didn't need to be. It had the specific quality of a door closing. Silence. "I'm not asking twice." The tall one said his name. He said it the way you said something when you were hoping the saying of it would make everything stop. And when it didn't stop anything, his expression shifted into something younger, something that was closer to the actual age on his face. The man with the gray eyes looked at the little girl still wrapped around his neck. Then he looked back at the teenagers. "You're going to stand right there," he said. "You're not going to move. My people are going to take some information down, and you are going to give it to them correctly, and then I'm going to figure out what happens next." He stood, keeping the girl cradled against his chest with one arm, and walked toward Eli. He stopped a few feet away and crouched down to eye level, which was a specific choice, and looked at him with those flat gray eyes, and was quiet for a moment. "You did that," he said. "Not a question." Eli said nothing. "You put yourself between those boys and my daughter." Still nothing. What was there to say about it? The man looked at him for a long moment. He had a way of looking at people that felt like being read rather than seen, like the kind of attention that collected information without demanding it, that noticed things you hadn't offered. "How old are you?" 12. "Where are your parents?" Eli met his eyes. "I don't have any." Another long moment. The child against the man's chest had turned her face slightly to look at Eli over her father's shoulder, and her eyes were still red and wet, but something in them had shifted from terror into something he didn't quite know how to categorize. "What's your name?" "Eli." The man nodded once, slowly, the way people nodded when they were processing something past the edges of what they'd prepared for tonight. "I'm Ronan," he said. He didn't offer a hand, he just said it, simple, the way you told someone your name when you wanted them to have it. "My daughter says you fell down and kept getting up," Ronan said. "She says you told them they had to go through you." Eli looked at the ground. "Why?" Ronan said. The question was not complicated. It should not have been hard to answer. But Eli sat there with blood drying on his face and his ribs sending sharp messages every time he breathed, and he tried to find the words for it, and what came out was not the whole truth, but it was the part of the truth he was willing to hand to a stranger. "Because I remembered what it felt like," he said, "when nobody did." The alley was very quiet. From somewhere beyond the entrance, engines idled. The sound of them was low and constant, like a pulse, like something alive choosing to wait. Ronan looked at him for a long time. Then he stood. He said something over his shoulder to the young man with the scar, something Eli didn't catch, and the young man nodded. "We're going to get that looked at," Ronan said to Eli, gesturing at his face. "You're going to come with us." "I'm fine." "You're not fine." "I don't—" Eli stopped, started over. The old instinct was running at full volume, the one that said strangers wanted things, that nothing was free, that the safest position was always alone and moving. "I don't know you." "No," Ronan said. "You don't." He didn't argue it, didn't push, just stood there, his daughter's face tucked against his neck, and looked at Eli with those flat, patient eyes. "My daughter says you stayed," he said, "even when you didn't have to." "So did you," Eli said, before he could stop himself. Something moved through Ronan's expression. Not much, just enough. "Yeah," he said. "I did." He turned and started toward the alley entrance. The young man with the scar put a hand under Eli's arm and helped him up without making a production of it, and Eli didn't have enough left to fight it. He walked out of the alley between strangers, into the wall of headlights, and the rumble of engines and the cold January air, and for one sharp and terrifying moment he understood that everything was about to change. What he didn't understand yet, what he couldn't have, was what was waiting for him inside the place they were taking him to. What he didn't know was what Ronan Voss was to the people of this city, what his name meant in certain corners of Millhaven, what the name on the back of that cut represented to the people who feared it and the people who lived beneath its protection. What he didn't know was that the young man with the scar had already pulled out a phone and was making a call, his voice low and careful, saying words Eli couldn't make out over the engines. What he didn't know was that somewhere in that convoy, riding toward the clubhouse, one of the men had already recognized the three teenagers from something that had nothing to do with tonight, something older, something that was about to surface in a way that would drag Eli into the center of a conflict he hadn't seen coming. He sat in the sidecar of an old Harley he hadn't even known was there, Ronan's jacket around his shoulders, smelling of leather and road and something that almost resembled warmth, and he looked back once at the alley receding in the dark. The girl in the pink coat was gone. Safe. The three teenagers were still standing there under the supervision of two men who hadn't moved. And Eli turned forward as the convoy pulled out into the night, and he did not look back again. He didn't know yet what was coming. But somewhere in the structure of the next few hours, between the engines and the clubhouse, and the particular quality of light that filtered through old neon signs at 2 in the morning, the life he'd been living was already over. He just didn't know what was supposed to come next. The clubhouse was not what Eli expected. He didn't know exactly what he'd expected. Something from movies, maybe. Something with pool tables and women and the particular performed menace of men who wanted you to know they were dangerous. What he got instead was a long, low building on the industrial edge of Millhaven's East Grid, wedged between a salvage yard and a concrete wall that someone had been painting murals on for years, layer over layer, so that the oldest images bled through the newest ones like bruises. The building itself was wood and corrugated metal and poured concrete in equal measure, patched and repatched over what looked like decades, and it looked exactly like what it was. A place that had survived a lot of things by refusing to be pretty about it. Inside, the air was warm. That was the first thing Eli registered before anything else. Warm air. The specific relief of a body that has been cold for so long it has forgotten the absence of cold is not normal. He stood in the main room and tried not to show how much the warmth affected him. He was not entirely successful. The room was large and low-ceilinged, with wooden floors that had absorbed 30 years of boot traffic, and showed it, neon signs on the walls throwing red and blue light across everything, a long wooden bar along the far wall with nobody behind it, a cluster of mismatched chairs and tables that looked like they'd been acquired one at a time over a very long period without any organizing principle beyond. This one works. A wood stove in the corner was going hard, and the heat from it was the reason the place was survivable. A dozen men moved through the space with the efficient quiet of people who knew where everything was and didn't need to discuss it. Nobody was performing anything. Nobody was making eye contact with Eli in a way that felt like a test. They just moved, and the movement had the particular rhythm of people who had been in the same space long enough that they'd stopped having to think about each other. The young man with the scar, Eli still didn't have his name, had walked him to a long wooden table near the stove and indicated a chair in the specific wordless way that was somewhere between an invitation and an instruction. Eli sat. His ribs informed him immediately that this was a mistake and then resigned themselves to it. Ronan had taken Sadie to a back room. Eli could hear her voice through the closed door, the cadence of a child coming down from a bad scare. Sentences that broke in the middle and restarted. Ronan's voice underneath, low, patient, steady. The specific register of a parent working to be solid when everything in them wants to come apart. A woman appeared from somewhere behind the bar. She was in her 50s, broad-shouldered, with gray-streaked hair pulled back and an expression that suggested she had assessed Eli's situation completely in the time it took her to cross the room and had made several decisions about it. She set a first aid kit on the table, sat across from him, did not ask permission before opening it. "I'm Deb," she said. "Don't move your head." "I'm fine." "You've got a cut above your eyebrow that's going to scar if it doesn't get closed, and your left eye is swelling shut. You're not fine." She said it without heat, the way you stated weather conditions. "Hold still." He held still. She worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this particular thing many times before, and she did it without commentary on how he'd gotten into this condition, which he appreciated more than he would have been able to say. The young man with the scar dropped into a chair across the table and set 2 mugs down, coffee, actual coffee, black and still steaming, and pushed one toward Eli without looking at him. "Cage," he said. Eli looked at him. "My name, Cage." He wrapped both hands around his own mug. "Before you start wondering, I wasn't, you were. Not hostile, just accurate." "Everybody does, it's fine." Eli pulled the coffee mug toward him. The warmth of it through the ceramic went straight up his arms. He thought about not drinking it, thought about the calculus of obligation, what it meant to accept things from people who hadn't told him the price yet. And then he drank it because he was 12 years old and he hadn't been warm in 6 days, and some arithmetic stopped being worth doing. "How long?" Cage said. "How long what?" "Street." Eli looked at the table. 2 years. No response to that. No performance of shock or pity. Cage just nodded, once, slow, the way you nodded when information confirmed something you'd already suspected. You got people somewhere. No. System? Aged out. Foster. He said it flat, because that was the only way to say it without it becoming something he'd have to manage in front of a stranger. 3 placements. Last one didn't work out. Cage's jaw moved. He didn't say anything. Deb pressed a butterfly closure over the cut above Eli's eye with steady fingers and said nothing. But her hands, for just a moment, slowed, just slightly, just enough. The door to the back room opened and Ronan came out alone. He moved through the main room with the kind of deliberate calm that Eli was starting to understand was not actually calm. It was the outer surface of something being very carefully contained. He stopped at the bar, poured something from a bottle into a glass, and stood there with his back to the room for a moment. Nobody spoke. He turned around. "She's asleep," he said. "To no one in particular. To everyone. The way you said something out loud when you needed to hear it yourself." A man at the far table, older, built like a retired defensive lineman, with a white beard and a scar that ran from his left ear down to the collar of his flannel shirt, let out a long breath and nodded. Something in the room shifted slightly, a collective drop in tension, not much but measurable. Ronan crossed to the table where Eli sat and dropped into the chair at the head of it. He set his glass down. He looked at Eli's face, at Deb's work, the closures and the cleaned cuts, and the eye that was going to be spectacular by morning, and then he looked at the table. "You need to eat," he said. "I'm okay." Ronan looked up at him. Those gray eyes moved over his face in that reading way again. "When's the last time you ate?" Eli said nothing. "I'm not asking to judge you," Ronan said. "I'm asking because I need to know what you need." That sentence did something specific and uncomfortable in Eli's chest. He'd heard a lot of sentences in 2 years, most of them variations on, "Move along, not my problem, you can't stay here." He had not heard that particular configuration of words in a very long time, delivered in that specific tone, which was the tone of a person who had asked a question and actually intended to receive the answer. 4 days, Eli said. Ronan held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked at the man with the white beard and said a single word, "Kitchen." The man was already moving. Cage refilled Eli's coffee without being asked. Deb finished with the kit, repacked it, and stood. And before she left, she put one hand briefly on top of Eli's. Just for a second, just long enough to be unambiguous. And then she was gone without looking back, the way people did things when they didn't want to make them into a thing. Eli stared at the table. His ribs were a sustained low fire. His left eye was down to a slit. He was sitting in a warm room with coffee and what appeared to be food coming, surrounded by men he'd known for approximately 40 minutes, men whose patches he couldn't fully read, and whose history he knew nothing about, and every single instinct he'd developed over 2 years of surviving alone was screaming at him, "This is not safe, this is not real, this is going to cost you something." But underneath that, underneath all of it, was something else, something quieter and more dangerous. It felt like standing next to a fire after too long in the cold. Not comfort exactly, more like the painful awareness of how cold you had actually been. He didn't trust it. He didn't have to trust it to feel it. A plate appeared in front of him. Eggs, toast, a pile of something that might have been potatoes. The man with the white beard set it down and retreated without fanfare, and Eli looked at the food and then at Ronan, who was watching him with those flat, patient eyes. "Go ahead," Ronan said. Eli ate. He tried to do it slowly. He was not entirely successful at that either. The room breathed around him. Men talked in low voices at other tables. The wood stove ticked. Outside, through the corrugated metal walls, he could still hear the engines, not driving, idling, some of them, the particular low pulse of Harleys being kept warm in the cold. Somewhere in the building, his 3 attackers were in a room. He didn't know what room. He didn't know what was happening to them. The not knowing sat in his stomach alongside the eggs and the coffee and created a specific kind of pressure. "What are you going to do?" Eli said. Ronan looked at him. "With them. The ones from the alley." A pause. Ronan picked up his glass, turned it in his hands, set it back down without drinking from it. "I haven't decided." "Are you going to hurt them?" The question came out more direct than Eli intended. He watched Ronan's face for the reaction to it and got very little. A slight tightening around the eyes, something assessed and set aside. "Why?" Ronan said. "Because you should know," Eli said carefully, that I'm not going to pretend I didn't see whatever you do. Silence. Long enough that Eli became aware of Cage going very still across the table. You trying to threaten me? Ronan said. No, Eli said. I'm just... He stopped, started over. I just don't want to owe somebody something for something I can't live with. Another long silence. Then Ronan leaned back in his chair and looked at him with an expression that had shifted into something Eli couldn't fully categorize. Not anger, something more complicated than that. Nobody's going to touch them, Ronan said. Not the way you're thinking. What way am I thinking? The way everybody thinks about us. He said it without bitterness, which made it worse somehow. We're going to talk to them, get their information, figure out who they are and what their situation is. He paused. And then I'm going to figure out what justice looks like for what they did. Justice, Eli said. That bother you? He turned the coffee mug in his hands. I've heard adults say that word before. Usually means something different from what it sounds like. Ronan said nothing, but he was looking at Eli with that attention again, that collecting quality, like he was filing things away without telling you what folder they went into. How old were you? Ronan said, when whatever happened, happened. Eli looked at him. You said you remembered what it felt like when nobody protected you. Ronan's voice was even, careful. That's not a general memory, that's a specific one. The room was very quiet around them. Eli had a strict personal policy about this particular territory. He did not go there with strangers. He did not go there with most people. The territory was sealed off behind walls he'd built carefully over 2 years, and he kept it sealed because the alternative, which he had tried once, briefly, with a school counselor who'd then proceeded to file a report that landed him back in the system in a worse situation than before, was not something he was willing to repeat. That's not something I talk about, he said. Okay, Ronan said, just that. Okay. No pushing, no, the only way to heal is to talk. About it routine, no visible display of patience designed to make him feel like he was failing by staying quiet. Just, okay. That bothered him more than pressure would have. The man with the white beard came back into the room, moved to Ronan, and bent down to say something in his ear. Ronan's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Some internal calibration, subtle and fast. Excuse me, he said to Eli. He stood, and he and the white-bearded man moved toward the back hallway. Cage watched them go. Then he looked at Eli. You want more coffee? What's happening? Eli said. Reaper's dealing with something. Reaper. Cage looked at him sideways. That's what people call him, outside of here. Eli turned that over. He'd heard the name, not in specific detail, not the full story behind it, but the name existed on the street in the particular way certain names existed. They preceded the person, traveled without them, arrived in conversations as a kind of weather warning. He'd heard it spoken the way people said the name of a place you didn't go to if you could help it. What do people call him in here? Eli said. Ronan, Cage said, like it was obvious, like it was the whole answer. The back hallway produced sounds for a few minutes that Eli couldn't identify. Voices, low and controlled, not raised, but with the particular tension of people managing something that didn't want to be managed. Then quiet. Then Ronan came back out alone. He walked to the table, sat down, looked at Eli for a moment. One of the boys in the back, he said. The tall one. His name is Mason Reed. Eli waited. Mason Reed's father runs a crew that operates out of the West Side Warehouse District. Ronan's voice was completely flat. They've been on our radar for about 8 months for something that has nothing to do with tonight. Eli felt the shift in the air before he fully understood it. So this isn't just, it's both things, Ronan said. What happened in the alley tonight is one thing. What Mason's father is going to think when he finds out his son is sitting in our clubhouse is a different thing. And those two things are going to collide, Ronan said. Yes. He looked at Eli directly, that gray gaze, steady and without apology. Which means you're in the middle of something, Ronan said, without choosing to be. I want you to know that. So I should go. You can go, Ronan said. Nobody's stopping you, but it's 4 in the morning and it's 17 degrees and you're... He stopped himself from finishing that sentence. Chose another one. The situation outside didn't get simpler tonight just because it happened in the dark. Eli looked at the door, looked at the stove. looked at his hands around the coffee mug and the butterfly closures on the cut above his eye that he could feel now with a steady, dull pulse. "Why does it matter to you?" he said. "Where I go?" Ronan was quiet for a moment. When he answered, it was carefully. "My daughter is 7 years old," he said. "She goes to school 3 blocks from where I found her tonight. I know every face on that block. I know every person who lives in every building on that block." He paused. "There was a boy on the corner at 8:15 tonight who saw her get pulled into that alley. I know this because my people talked to him 20 minutes ago. He watched it happen, and he kept walking." The room had gone completely quiet. Even the fire seemed to be listening. "You didn't keep walking," Ronan said. Eli didn't say anything. "I don't know you," Ronan said. You're right about that. But I know what you did, and I know what it cost you, and I know—" He stopped. Something moved across his face and was gone. "I know what it means when a kid that age has to be that alone to make that kind of decision." He didn't say what it meant. He just left that there. The wood stove ticked. Somewhere in the back of the building, behind the closed door with Ronan's daughter sleeping on the other side of it, a phone rang once and stopped. And in the main room's corner, Eli noticed for the first time what he should have registered earlier. A man sitting alone at a table along the far wall, nursing a drink, watching the room with the particular practiced stillness of someone who was observing professionally. He wasn't one of the crew. His cut was the wrong color. His patches were partially turned against his jacket, hidden, but not quite hidden enough. Cage had noticed Eli noticing. His jaw tightened slightly. "Who is that?" Eli said, low. Cage glanced at the man, then back at Eli. His voice dropped. "Problem," he said. One word. "Is he supposed to be here?" "No." "Does Ronan know?" Cage looked at Ronan across the table, who was in the middle of saying something to the white-bearded man who had reappeared. Reading the room, the quick calculation happening behind Cage's eyes. "Not yet," Cage said. Eli watched the stranger in the corner. The man wasn't looking at him, was carefully not looking at him, which was itself a kind of looking. He was looking at the back hallway, at the closed door, at the door behind which Sadie was sleeping. Eli set down his coffee mug. The ceramic sound on the wooden table was soft, but in the particular quiet of that moment, it was enough. Ronan looked up, and Eli held his gaze and moved only his eyes toward the corner. 1 second, just long enough. He watched Ronan's face go through something fast and private, and then go completely still in a way that was different from the stillness he'd been wearing before. "Cage," Ronan said. His voice hadn't changed, not by a perceptible amount. "Go check on Sadie." Go check on Sadie." Cage was already moving, and the white-bearded man had shifted his angle, and 2 other men at the far table had shifted theirs, and the stranger in the corner was either completely unaware of the geometry rearranging around him or was aware of it and had decided it was already too late to matter. Eli sat very still with his hands around his empty coffee mug and watched the room change shape. Whatever the stranger had come for, he had come for it through the front door of the one place on Millhaven's east grid that Mason Reed's father would have needed intelligence on most urgently, on the night his son had been brought inside it. And whatever happened next, in the next 60 seconds, in the next hour, in the tectonic collision of everything that had been set in motion tonight, Eli Carter was in the center of it. Not because he'd chosen it, because he'd walked into an alley for a little girl in a pink coat. And now someone in this room had decided that made him something worth using. The stranger's name was Darren Cole, and he didn't fight when the 2 men appeared on either side of him. That was the first thing that was wrong. Eli watched it happen from the table. The smooth, almost rehearsed quality of the man's compliance. The way he set his glass down and stood without being asked to stand. The way his hands came up open and empty with the practiced ease of someone who had done this precise thing before and knew exactly how it was supposed to look. Not frightened, not surprised. Performing both, but underneath the performance was something quiet and deliberate. The way a man looked when the thing he'd come to do was already done. Ronan crossed the room in 8 steps. He stopped in front of Darren Cole and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. The way Eli was starting to understand was not patience. It was the particular stillness of a man deciding which version of himself was going to handle the next few minutes. "Who sent you?" Ronan said. "Nobody sent me." Cole's voice was mild, almost apologetic. "I came to talk." "You could have knocked." Would you have let me in? A pause. The room was absolutely still around them. Every man in it had oriented toward this corner, not moving, not speaking, just present, the way a weather system was present. You couldn't see the pressure change, but you could feel it in your joints. No, Ronan said. I wouldn't have. Cole nodded, like that was reasonable, like they were discussing a scheduling conflict. He was somewhere in his 40s, lean in the way that came from a life without surplus, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and a face that had been good-looking once and had aged into something harder and more interesting. His cut was the West Side colors. Eli could see it now, the partially turned patches, the deliberate concealment that had not been quite deliberate enough. Reed sent you, Ronan said. I told you. Your colors are Reed's. Your territory is Reed's. His boy is in my back room. Ronan's voice had not risen. Don't make me say it twice. A beat. Something shifted in Cole's expression. Not cracking, not yet, but adjusting, the way a man adjusted a story when one version of it stopped working. Danny Reed doesn't know I'm here, Cole said. Why not? Because what I came to tell you is something Danny Reed doesn't want you to know. The silence that followed had a different texture than the one before it. Eli felt it from across the room, the shift from confrontation into something more complicated, the particular alertness of men who recognized that the shape of a situation had just changed without them getting to vote on it. Ronan looked at him for another long moment. Then he said, back. 2 words. That was all. But the room understood them, and Cole was guided, not roughly, but without optionality, toward the back hallway, and Ronan followed, and the door closed, and Eli was left in the main room with the low fire and the neon light, and the sudden awareness of how loud the silence was. Cage came back from checking on Sadie. He stood in the doorway to the back hall, looked at the closed door, looked at Eli. What happened? Eli said. They're talking. Cage dropped into the chair across from him. His jaw was tight. You flagged him. I noticed him. Same thing. Cage picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, set it back down. Ronan noticed you noticing. He stopped. What? That's not something most people do. Flag a thing without flagging it. He looked at Eli sideways. How long did you say you've been on the street? 2 years. Cage nodded slowly. You learn to read a room fast. You learn to read everything fast, Eli said, or you don't last. The man with the white beard, whose name Eli had gathered from fragments of conversation, was Dutch, had settled at a table by the stove with 3 other men, and they were talking in voices too low to parse, but with the specific body language of people running contingencies. Heads together. Occasional glances at the back hallway door. The kind of conversation that was happening in the space between words as much as in the words themselves. Eli's ribs had settled into a dull, constant complaint. His left eye was effectively closed. The food had done something for the hollow, desperate quality of his hunger, but had not fixed it entirely. 2 years of scarcity had built a need that one plate couldn't address. He was warm, which he could not entirely process, kept expecting the warmth to end. 20 minutes passed. Maybe more. Then the back hallway door opened, and Ronan came out first, and the look on his face was not something Eli could read cleanly, but it read as bad, and Dutch stood up before Ronan had crossed half the room, and something passed between them in a look that covered ground quickly. Cole came out behind Ronan. His face was different. He looked like a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. Not relieved exactly, more like emptied. Like a building after something has been removed from the load-bearing walls. Ronan stopped in the center of the room. He looked around at his men, and then his eyes found Eli at the table and stayed there for a moment before moving on. Everybody needs to hear this, Ronan said, because what we thought tonight was about is not what tonight is about. Dutch said, How bad? Bad, Ronan said. He moved to the bar and stood with his back against it, and Cole stood a few feet away from him with the 2 men who'd collected him maintaining loose positions on either side, and the room rearranged itself around this new configuration, men pulling chairs to face the center or just standing where they were. Danny Reed has been building something for 18 months, Ronan said. I knew he was active. I knew he had interests in the warehouse district. What I didn't know... He stopped, set his jaw, continued. What I didn't know is that part of what he's been building involves this club. Nobody spoke. He's been acquiring debt, Ronan said, specifically the debt of people connected to us, business owners we've worked with, families and neighborhoods we protect. He's been buying up their notes, their loans, their back rent, whatever they owe, through shell companies so the face of the debt changes and nobody traces it back to him. He paused. Once he holds the debt, he holds the leverage. And once he holds the leverage, he owns them, Dutch said. His voice was flat as concrete. He owns their cooperation, Ronan said, their silence, their access. He looked around the room. He's been working his way toward this clubhouse for 8 months. He's got 8 people in our extended network compromised. 8 people who owe money they can't pay to a man who now owns what they owe. The room absorbed this. Eli sat completely still. I was trying to understand the architecture of what he was hearing, the scale of it, the patience it required, the particular cold intelligence behind constructing a siege that the people inside didn't know was a siege. "What does he want?" one of the men said from the back of the room. Ronan looked at Cole. Cole looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "He wants the territory," Cole said. "All of it. The east side, the industrial corridor, the neighborhoods you've been protecting for the last decade. He wants it cleared so he can operate without—" He stopped. "Without the problem of you being in the way." "That's not new," Dutch said. "Plenty of people have wanted that." "This is different," Cole said, "because he has a mechanism now. He doesn't need to fight you. He's going to starve you, cut off every business that supplies you, every family that supports you, every mechanic, every building owner, everybody who has ever covered for you or helped you or looked the other way. He's going to squeeze them all at once, and when this club can't operate and can't move and has no ground to stand on—" He let the sentence end without finishing it. "His boy being here is not an accident," Ronan said. It wasn't a question. Cole shook his head. Mason didn't know what he was doing. He's 17, he's stupid, he's trying to be his father. He picked the wrong alley. But the moment he ended up here— He paused. "Danny Reed found out within 2 hours. I don't know who made the call, but somebody in this building or somebody standing outside it tonight told Danny Reed that his son was here by midnight." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Eli felt it. The collective shift as every man in the space recalculated the last several hours, reran the night's events against this new information. Someone in this building. Eli looked at Cage. Cage's jaw was working. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, which meant he was looking at everyone. "Why are you here?" Dutch said to Cole. Not hostile, measured, clinical. "Why are you telling us this?" Cole turned the empty glass in his hands that someone had apparently let him keep. "Because I've been with Danny Reed for 11 years, he said. 11 years. I've done things I'm not going to talk about in a room full of people I don't know. But I've got a daughter, she's 9. And about 3 months ago, Danny started talking about what happens when this is done. What the neighborhood looks like after, what kind of place it becomes." He stopped. His hands were still on the glass, but the glass had stopped moving. "He's not building a territory," Cole said. "He's building a machine, and the people in those neighborhoods, the families, the old people, the kids, they're not going to be protected by anything when he's done. They're going to be raw material." Silence. "I'm not a good person," Cole said. It was a flat, unperformed statement, the kind that costs something. "I know what I am, I know what I've done, but I got a kid, and she goes to school 6 blocks from here, and what Danny Reed is building is the kind of thing I can't explain to her in 10 years. I can't—" His voice, for the first time, did something involuntary. He brought it back quickly. "I can't leave her that." Ronan looked at him for a long time. "You understand," Ronan said, "that coming here doesn't make you safe." "I know. You understand that Danny Reed is going to find out you were here. He probably already knows. So you came here knowing that." "Yes." Another long silence. Ronan straightened from the bar and looked at his men. "Everybody think about who they talked to tonight," he said, "about where their phones have been and who had access to them, about who knew we were bringing the boy in." A pause. "I need the name of whoever called Danny Reed. I need it by morning." The room was very quiet. Eli had stopped being invisible to himself in this situation approximately 10 minutes ago. He was doing that specific thing his brain did under extreme stress, watching the situation from slightly outside himself, processing it in layers, The way you processed a street that might have multiple threats on it. Front, sides, behind. What was visible? What wasn't visible but was present? What the visible things were covering for? There was a traitor in this building, or connected closely enough to it to have real-time information. Ronan knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. And everyone in the room was now looking at everyone else in the room with the particular quality of attention that came from rerunning trust calculations in real time. Cole moved his gaze across the space, and it landed on Eli. Stayed there. Just for a moment too long to be incidental. "The boy," Cole said. Ronan's gaze went to Eli and then back to Cole. "What about him?" "He doesn't have a name in this," Cole said. "He doesn't have a history in this. Nobody in Danny Reed's network knows he exists." He paused. "Danny knows his son is here. He knows Ronan Voss picked up his son from an alley. What he doesn't know is that there was a witness, a third party." Another pause. "That has some value." The room got very still. Eli understood what was being said. He understood it the way you understood things in a street situation, not with his brain first, but with something older and faster than his brain, some animal-level reading of geometry and intention. He was 12 years old. He was 63 pounds. He was nobody. And to a certain kind of person, that was a resource. "No," Ronan said. "Just that. No deliberation, no visible calculation." "He's not part of this." "He's already part of this," Cole said, not unkindly. "I'm not saying use him. I'm saying the fact of him is a variable. Danny Reed finds out there's a witness to tonight, a kid with nothing to lose and no allegiance." "I said no," Ronan said. Cole went quiet. But the damage was done in the sense that the thought was now in the room, and the thought had a specific weight, and Eli could feel the weight of it in the way certain men were carefully not looking at him, and certain others were carefully looking too much. He was a variable. He was useful in the way that things with no attachment were useful. They could be moved around without cost, deployed without obligation. That was a familiar feeling. He'd been that for most of his life. What was not familiar was the way Ronan had shut it down. One syllable. No visible conflict, no brief pause where the calculation happened. Just no. Eli turned this over and didn't know what to do with it, so he set it aside. "I need to know everything he knows," Ronan said to Cole. "Every name, every business he's compromised, every shell company, every amount, every person." He looked at Dutch. "Put him somewhere comfortable and put Heck outside the door." Dutch nodded. "Comfortable," Ronan repeated, making sure the word landed correctly. Cole was escorted to somewhere in the back of the building, and the room shifted again in his absence. The conversations that had been suspended during his presence restarted, low and immediate and serious, men in clusters working through implications. Ronan came to the table. He stood rather than sitting. He looked at Eli. "You heard all of that," he said. "Yes." "Questions?" Eli looked up at him. "What happens to me if the person who called Reed is in this building?" Ronan's expression didn't move. "What do you mean?" "Whoever made that call," Eli said. "They did it to tell Reed his son was here. But they also told him everything else about tonight, including me." He paused. "So if that person is still in this room, then Reed already knows I exist. And you said yourself that he's going to find out Cole was here, Eli. Which means he's going to find out Cole told you things. Which means he's going to want to know what Cole said and who heard it. Eli." Ronan's voice was not raised, but it had a specific quality that landed. "Stop." Eli stopped. "You're not wrong," Ronan said quietly, "but I need you to not run that math out loud right now." He leaned down slightly, one hand on the table, bringing his voice to something between them rather than for the room. "There are men in here I'd trust with my life, and men I'm not sure about tonight. Until I know which is which, I need everything in this room to look normal." He looked at Eli steadily, "Including you." "I don't know how to look normal here," Eli said. "I don't know any of these people." "That's actually useful," Ronan said. "You're not supposed to fit. Nobody's going to read you the wrong way." He straightened. "Just sit. Drink the coffee. Don't watch anyone too hard." "I can't not watch." Something moved through Ronan's expression. Almost something. "I know," he said, "but try." He moved away. And Eli sat and put his hands around another coffee that Cage silently appeared to refill, and he tried to look like a tired, hurt kid who wasn't cataloging every person in the room, and he was not entirely certain he was succeeding. 40 minutes passed. The wood stove. The neon. The low conversations. Outside, the rain had started. He could hear it against the corrugated metal, a sound like static, like the city trying to say something it didn't have the vocabulary for. At 3:10 in the morning, Dutch came into the main room from the back hallway and walked directly to Ronan in the corner, and what happened in his face when he reached him was something Eli caught from 30 feet away and couldn't look away from. Dutch was not a man whose face moved easily. What moved across it now was not a simple emotion. Ronan looked at him. "Found the phone," Dutch said. Low. "Burner. Back bedroom, under the floor panel by the second bunk." Ronan said nothing. "The bunk is Cage's," Dutch said. The name fell into the room like something dropped from a height. Eli looked at Cage, who was sitting 3 feet from him, both hands around his mug, very still. And what he saw in Cage's face was not the face of someone who had been named incorrectly. It was the face of someone waiting for the floor to come. Cage looked up, met Ronan's gaze across the room. The room understood in the same second Eli did. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The rain hit the metal walls with its flat, patient sound. Cage set his mug down, slowly. He looked at the table in front of him, then back up at Ronan, and what was in his face was the most terrifying thing Eli had seen all night. More terrifying than the alley, more terrifying than the stranger in the corner, more terrifying than everything Cole had described about Danny Reed's machine. It was someone who had already decided. Not someone caught. Someone who had been living with the decision for long enough that the being caught was almost a relief. "How long?" Ronan said. His voice was something Eli had no name for. It was not rage. It was what was on the other side of rage, the thing that was too large and too old for rage to be adequate to it. Cage looked at him. 6 months. The word 6 landed and kept landing, spreading outward, hitting different people in the room at different moments as the implications of it reached them. 6 months of operations. 6 months of movements and plans and conversations and decisions. 6 months of Cage at this table, in this room, in this building, with these men. "He has my brother," Cage said. His voice was steady. That was the worst part. The steadiness of it, the terrible calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment so many times in their own head that the actual living of it was just the last rehearsal. "Reed has my brother Ronan. He picked him up 8 months ago. He's been using him as leverage since November. I didn't have—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I didn't have another play." "You had a play," Dutch said from across the room. "You could have come to us." "With what?" Cage's voice changed for just a moment. A crack, a split-second fracture, before the steady came back. "With, hey, by the way, Reed's got my brother, and he's going to kill him if I don't feed him information about this club. That's the play?" He looked at Ronan. "I know what that conversation looks like. I know what happens to my brother while we're having that conversation." "You don't know that," Ronan said. "I know exactly that," Cage said, "because I know you, and I know what protecting this club means to you, and I know that one man, even someone you know, doesn't outweigh the safety of everyone in this room." His voice was level and without accusation. He was not trying to make Ronan wrong. He was just stating what he believed about the man in front of him, and it was not an insult, and that somehow made it worse. "I couldn't ask you to choose." "So you chose," Ronan said. "Yes." The rain, the stove. Eli sat at the table where Cage had been sitting across from him all night, refilling his coffee, answering his questions, putting a hand on his shoulder in the alley after the fighting was over, and he felt the specific vertigo of a situation revealing its actual shape versus the shape it had appeared to have. He had been sitting next to the source of the leak all night. Cage had flagged Darren Cole's presence at the bar, had been the one to say problem. And Eli understood now what that had been. Not loyalty, but cover. If Eli noticed Cole and Eli told Ronan, the trail stayed away from Cage. Cage had used him, had used Eli's street-sharpened instinct to route attention away from himself. Eli sat with this knowledge. It did not make him angry, exactly. It made him very tired. Ronan looked at Cage for a long time. The quality of that look was something Eli wouldn't be able to fully articulate afterward. It was grief and calculation, and something that looked briefly and privately like a man deciding whether something was still salvageable. Cage was young, 26, maybe 27, and Ronan had known him for years, and that history was somewhere in Ronan's face doing terrible arithmetic with the present. "Where is your brother?" Ronan said. Cage's expression changed. It changed the way a person's expression changed when they hadn't expected that to be the next sentence. "Ronan, where?" "I don't—" He stopped. "I have a number. They make contact every 72 hours. Last contact was yesterday morning. Give the number to Dutch. If Reed finds out I gave you that number, Reed is going to find out Cole was here in about 6 hours," Ronan said. "And when he does, whatever arrangement you and Reed have is finished. Because the value you had to him was your position in this room, and the moment Cole walks in here, your position is compromised and Reed knows it." He paused. "He's going to move on your brother regardless." Cage looked at him. The calculation happening behind his eyes was visible and brutal and fast. 72 hours, Cage said. "Less now. Maybe 40 hours before the next contact." "Then we have 40 hours, Ronan said. Something in Cage's face broke. Not dramatically, just a small collapse around the eyes, the specific relief and devastation of someone who has been holding something alone for so long that the act of no longer holding it alone is indistinguishable from falling. "Why?" Cage said. His voice was very quiet. "After what I did." Ronan looked at him with those gray eyes. "Because your brother didn't do anything. And because you made a terrible choice for a reason I understand." He paused. "I'll deal with what you did to this club, but I'm not leaving a man to Danny Reed while I do it." He turned to Dutch. "Lock down the building, nobody in or out, without my word. Get Cole talking with whoever we need to hear it, and find out which of our 8 compromised contacts can still be reached tonight." Dutch moved. The room moved with him. Ronan turned back and his gaze swept the room and landed last on Eli, who was sitting at the table with his empty mug and his patched-up face, and the specific stunned quality of a person who had walked into an alley to help a little girl and ended up at the center of something that had been building for 8 months. Eli looked at him. "I'm still here," he said. It wasn't defiance. It was just a statement of fact. He was still there. He hadn't moved. "I know," Ronan said. "I don't have anywhere to go," Eli said. "But I also—" He stopped, made himself say the rest of it. "I don't want to go. I want to know what happens." Ronan held his gaze. For a long moment he just looked at Eli, at the 12-year-old boy with the closed eye and the butterfly closures and the wool blanket smell, and the 2 years of street reading behind his eyes, sitting in the middle of an adult crisis he hadn't chosen and refusing to treat it like it wasn't his to care about. "Get some sleep," Ronan said finally. "There's a cot in the back storage room. Deb will show you. And then tomorrow is going to be very complicated," Ronan said. "And I might need someone in this building who isn't tangled up in any of this to do something simple." "What's something?" Ronan looked at him. "I don't know yet," he said. "But you flag things. And right now I need people who flag things." He paused. "So sleep. And stay." He walked away. Eli sat at the table. The rain came down on the metal walls. The fire in the stove moved behind its grate. Somewhere in the back of the building, Sadie Voss was sleeping in a room with Cage's scar-faced ghost of a confession, somewhere in the air, and Danny Reed's 40-hour clock running in the dark. And in the morning, when everything that had been set in motion tonight finally arrived at the address it had been heading to all along, a 12-year-old boy who had survived 2 years of the city's silence was going to have to decide whether surviving and standing were still the same thing. He suspected they were not. He suspected they had stopped being the same thing the moment he walked into the alley. He just didn't know yet what that was going to cost him. He slept for 3 hours and 20 minutes. He knew the exact duration because he'd checked the clock on the wall when Deb showed him the storage room. A narrow space behind the kitchen with a cot that smelled like motor oil and old canvas. A single bulb overhead that she switched off without asking whether he wanted it off. A wool blanket folded at the foot of the cot that was thicker than anything he'd slept under in 2 years. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the rain on the roof and the muffled sounds of the building staying awake around him. Boots on wood floors, low voices, the occasional scrape of a chair. And he told himself he would not sleep because sleeping in an unknown place with unknown people and a compromised security situation and Danny Reed's 40-hour clock running somewhere in the dark was not a thing a person with functional survival instincts did. He was asleep within 4 minutes. When he woke, the rain had stopped. The building had a different sound, still occupied, still active, but the specific quality of activity had changed from the urgent middle-of-the-night register to something grimmer and more purposeful. He could hear Dutch's voice somewhere, not the words, just the cadence of someone delivering information that required the listener to make decisions. He could hear the distant sound of an engine turning over in the garage adjacent to the main building, someone running a bike in the cold pre-dawn air. He lay still for 30 seconds. Took inventory. Ribs, still a sustained complaint, worse than last night from the stiffening that happened during sleep. Left eye, down to a slit, the flesh around it swollen tight and tender to the air. Hands, scraped, the right one bruised across the knuckles from somewhere in the alley that he hadn't registered at the time. Hunger, present, lower than last night, the eggs and toast still doing residual work. He sat up. The cot didn't make a sound. He sat in the dark for a moment and thought about Cage, about sitting across from him at that table for most of the night, accepting coffee, accepting the hand on his shoulder, accepting the frank and functional companionship of someone who had turned out to be running a calculation that included using Eli as cover without Eli's knowledge. He thought about how he felt about that and discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that what he felt was not primarily betrayal. He'd been used before. The street used you constantly. Everyone on it was working some angle, trading something, running some calculus. What he felt about Cage was closer to a specific sadness, the kind that came from recognizing the shape of a trap someone had been in long before they made the choices that came to define them. Cage had a brother. Someone Reed had turned into a weapon against him. Eli had had no one to be turned into a weapon, which meant, in this particular arithmetic, that his solitude had been a kind of protection. That thought sat in him strangely. He found his shoes. He'd been right about the laces. He'd kept them tied, old habit, and stood and moved to the door and opened it onto the kitchen. Deb was at the stove. She turned when he appeared, looked at his face, turned back to the stove. "Sit," she said. He sat. A plate appeared in front of him within 3 minutes. Eggs again, coffee again, a piece of bread with butter that had clearly been made somewhere other than a factory. He ate without being told to. I was getting slightly better at accepting things. "What time is it?" he said. 6:40. "What's happening?" She looked at him from the stove, measured something. "Ronan's in the garage with Dutch and 2 others. They've been in there since 5. She paused. Cole talked most of the night. "There's a list." "Of the people Reed compromised." "Of the people Reed compromised." She turned back to the stove. 8 businesses, 3 families, 2 men in the city's permitting office. She said it with the flat economy of someone who had lived in proximity to difficult information long enough that the information itself no longer surprised her, only its specific contents. "And one name that's causing a problem." Eli looked up. "What name?" She was quiet for a moment, doing something with the pan that didn't require the attention she was giving it. "There's a social worker," she said. "Woman named Patricia Hale. She works out of the East Side Family Services office." She set the pan down. "Reed's had a financial hold on her since last spring, her mother's medical debt. He bought it, and he's been sitting on it." She looked at Eli. "Her caseload is mostly kids in the foster system, kids aging out, kids in placements that are—" She stopped. "Kids in bad situations." Eli put his fork down. "He's been using her to identify kids with no advocates," Deb said. "Nobody to ask questions, nobody to notice." She held his gaze. "You aged out of your last placement 7 months ago. The placement before that." "Stop," Eli said. She stopped. He sat very still. The coffee steamed in front of him. The kitchen was warm and smelled like butter and old wood, and he was sitting in it with the specific sensation of the floor dropping away beneath his feet, while the floor remained entirely where it was. Patricia Hale. I didn't know the name, but he knew the office. He'd been through it twice. The institutional smell of it, the plastic chairs, the particular way the fluorescent light made everyone look like a diagnosis. He'd had 2 different workers. He didn't know which cases Patricia Hale carried. He didn't know who had been in charge of him before the last placement collapsed. He wasn't tracking me specifically, Eli said. It wasn't a question. He was working it out. He was tracking a category. Cole thinks so, Deb said. But Cole also said Reed has been, she paused, choosing words carefully, developing a specific interest in the situation around this club, and anyone connected to it. I'm not connected to it. I was connected to it for 6 hours. You protected Ronan's daughter, Deb said. In this city, in this neighborhood, in the network of people who watch things and report things, that makes you connected. She looked at him steadily. Cole says Reed knew about the alley within 2 hours. The social worker connection is separate, but Reed is thorough. He'll pull that thread when he finds it. Eli picked his fork back up, set it down again. His hands were doing something he didn't like, a fine tremor that he controlled by flattening both palms on the table. 2 years of the street had given him an education in what it looked like when you became visible to the wrong people. He had worked very hard to stay the specific kind of invisible that kept you alive. One night, one alley, one little girl in a pink coat. And now he was in a database somewhere that connected him to a man who used children the way other people used currency. The garage door between the kitchen and the adjacent workspace opened. Ronan came through it. He was wearing a different jacket, darker, and there was something on his left hand. Not blood, grease, but he'd been working on something physical. He stopped when he saw Eli at the table, and something in his face did a small readjustment. "You're up," he said. "Deb told me about Patricia Hale," Eli said. Ronan looked at Deb. Deb met his look with the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was comfortable defending it. "All right," Ronan said. He pulled out the chair across from Eli and sat. He looked at Eli for a moment, then looked at the table, then back up. "Tell me about your last placement." "Why?" "Because I need to know how deep this goes before I can figure out what to do about it." Eli looked at him. Ronan's face was tired, genuinely tired, the kind that came from a night of no sleep and sustained high-stakes decision-making. But underneath the tiredness was the same quality he'd had in the alley. Present, specific, not performing attention, actually paying it. "The last placement was a man named Vickers," Eli said, "outside the city. He took in 3 kids at a time. The state paid him per kid." He stopped, made himself continue. "He was not..." He looked at the table. "He didn't hurt me physically, but the situation was not..." He couldn't find the right construction. He reported what the state needed him to report. What was actually happening in that house was different. "How long were you there?" 4 months. "How old were you?" 10. Ronan was quiet for a moment. "And before that?" "A couple in Hargrove. They were okay. But they had a baby, and the dynamic changed, and they couldn't manage 3 placements anymore." He paused. "Before that, I was with my grandmother." He looked up. "She died. That's how I got into the system." Something moved through Ronan's face. He didn't speak for a moment. "When you left Vickers' placement," he said, "you didn't go back into the system." "No." "Why?" Eli looked at him. "Because the system kept putting me in places like Vickers." The kitchen was very quiet. The coffee steamed. Somewhere outside, an engine turned over. One of the Harleys, idling in the cold morning air, doing what bikes did when their riders needed to think. "Okay," Ronan said. He said it the same way he'd said it the night before, when Eli refused to talk about his past. The same. "Okay, that's enough. I have what I need. No pushing past what was given. No extraction of more than was offered." "Cole is still talking," Ronan said. "He gave us 12 names total. Patricia Hale is one of them. I have people making contact with each of them this morning, carefully, quietly, so Reed doesn't see movement." He paused. "The situation with Cage's brother is more complicated. The contact number Cage gave Dutch. We traced it to a warehouse in the Port District. We think that's where Reed has been running his operations, using the warehouse district access he built up over the last year." "You're going to go there," Eli said. "I'm going to need to verify it first." "How?" Ronan held his gaze for a moment. "This is the part where I'm going to need you to do something." Eli had expected it. Deb had said it. Ronan had said it the night before. "You flag things. I might need someone who isn't tangled up in this. He'd known it was coming, and he'd thought about it in the storage room while supposedly sleeping, and he'd arrived at the conclusion that he was going to say yes before he knew what the thing was, which was either the smartest or the stupidest decision he'd ever made. And he was 12 years old, so the competition wasn't extensive. Say it, Eli said. Reed is watching this building, Ronan said. He's been watching it since midnight, when he found out his son was here. He's got people on the road outside and probably one at each end of the block. He paused. A kid walking out of here in the morning is not a threat signal. A kid walking out of here in the morning looks like the most natural thing in the world. Homeless kid who maybe got food, maybe slept somewhere warm, moving on. He held Eli's gaze. I need eyes on the east end of Crane Street. I need to know how many people Reed has positioned out there and whether the man in the gray pickup that Dutch clocked at 2 in the morning is still in place. You want me to walk past them? I want you to walk the block. Go to the corner, look at the salvage yard across the street like you're deciding whether to try the gate, come back. You know how to move in a space without looking like you're reading it. Yes. You don't have to do this, Ronan said. I know. The risk. I know the risk, Eli said. I've been reading Street since I was 10. He looked at Ronan. I'll do it, but I want something. Ronan waited. After this, Eli said, whatever happens today, after it's done, I want you to tell me what you actually think about what happens to me. Whether this, he gestured at the room around him, a gesture that meant more than the room, is something or whether it's just tonight. He held Ronan's gaze. I don't want to be managed. I just want the truth. Ronan looked at him for a long moment. That's fair, he said. Okay, Eli said. He pushed back from the table and stood. His ribs protested the movement. He ignored them. Give me 5 minutes and I'll go. He walked out through the main room. The space was populated differently than the night before, by fewer men, all of them awake and working at something, a couple with phones, one with what looked like a map spread on the big table. The neon signs were off. The gray morning light coming through the high windows was thin and cold, the specific gray of a January morning in Millhaven after rain, the color the city turned when it stopped pretending. He stood for a moment and let the room exist around him. He thought about the alley, the pink coat, the scatter of small toys across wet pavement. He thought about the fact that the chain of events that had led to this moment had started with a sound he'd heard from the street. Not a word, not a call for help, just the sound of things being scattered and a laugh that wasn't about anything being funny. He wondered what would have happened if he'd been asleep when it started. If the heating grate on Mercer Street had been his destination and he'd reached it 10 minutes earlier and been buried in his garbage bag and his wool blanket, nobody would have known the difference. Sadie Voss would have been alone in that alley with 3 people who meant her harm, and Ronan Voss would have arrived eventually. The convoy had been close, the response time was minutes, but the minutes would have been different. The minutes would have mattered. He had not been asleep. He'd been walking, and the sound had reached him. That was the whole of it. That was the entire mechanism. A boy awake when he might have been sleeping, walking when he might have been still. He went to the door. Outside, Millhaven was doing what it did in January mornings, gray and cold and indifferent, the streets wet from the night's rain, the few people moving through them doing so with the head-down purposefulness of people who had somewhere specific to be and no patience for anything else. He turned up the collar of Ronan's jacket, which was still around his shoulders, which was absurdly large on his frame, and he put his hands in his pockets and he walked. He moved the way he always moved, which was without apparent direction, not dawdling, not hurrying. The specific pace of someone who was moving because standing still in the cold was worse than moving, which was a pace anyone in Millhaven could read and categorize and dismiss. He moved east on the sidewalk and let his eyes do their work, which they did automatically, which they had been doing automatically for 2 years. The gray pickup was still there. East end of Crane Street, nosed in against the curb outside the salvage yard. 2 men in the cab, both of them doing the thing people did when they were trying to look like they weren't doing anything. Phones too deliberately positioned, bodies too deliberately not looking. Amateur hour, by the standards of someone who'd learned to spot surveillance from the street, but they weren't trying to fool anyone sophisticated. They were just there to watch a building and report movement. He walked past them at a distance of maybe 15 feet. He did not look at the truck. He looked at the salvage yard gate, the way a kid looked at something that might or might not be worth trying. A brief speculative look, the specific expression of someone calculating whether the effort of getting in was worth whatever might be inside. He stood at the gate for approximately 30 seconds, one hand on the chain link, looking through it at the stacked metal and the silent yard equipment. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come. He counted 2 additional men on the block, one at the west end, leaning against a building with a coffee cup that had stopped steaming long enough ago to be obviously not the reason he was standing there. One on the opposite side of the street, parked in a car with the engine running, which in the cold was normal enough, but the angle of the car was wrong. Nosed out, ready to pull, not the angle of someone who had just stopped briefly. 4 total. Plus whatever was positioned on the street parallel, which he couldn't see but would bet existed. He went back inside. Ronan was where he'd left him, standing now, talking to Dutch in the main room with a mug in one hand and the other hand flat on the table over what was indeed a map. Both of them looked up when Eli came in. "Gray pickup is still there," Eli said. 2 in the cab. 1 on foot at the west end, coffee, been there a while. 1 vehicle on the south side of the street, engine running, bad angle. He's staged to follow, not to watch. He paused. 4 that I could see. Probably more on the parallel. Dutch looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Eli. "Anything else?" "The one in the truck on the east end, passenger side." Eli paused. "He's got a radio, not a phone. He touched his collar twice while I was at the gate. He's reporting." Another look between Ronan and Dutch. This one had more in it. "Active surveillance," Dutch said. Not a question. "Active," Eli confirmed, and then felt briefly strange about the fact that he'd said it the way Dutch said it, with that same flat professional register, because he was 12, and he'd learned the vocabulary from watching, not from training, and the 2 things were not the same, but they had apparently produced similar-sounding outputs. Ronan set his mug down. "Reed is going to move today," he said. "He knows Cole is here. He knows we have Mason. He's going to pull the trigger on the pressure campaign before we can get ahead of it. Contact all 8 compromised parties simultaneously. Call in every debt, cut off every supply line at once." "Can he do that in 1 day?" Dutch said. "If he's organized enough to build it over 8 months, Ronan said. "He's organized enough to collapse it in 1 morning. Dutch straightened, looked at the map. "We need to move first." "We need to move smart," Ronan said. "Moving first and moving stupid is how people get hurt." He looked around the room, at the men available, at the map, at something Eli couldn't read but could feel, the weight of a decision being approached from multiple angles simultaneously, the way a man stood when he was carrying something that required him to be very precise about where he put his feet. His gaze came to rest on Eli again. "Go in the back," Ronan said. "Check on Sadie. She's going to be awake and she's going to be—" He paused. "She needs someone to sit with her who isn't trying to solve 6 other problems at the same time." "I'm not," Eli started. "I know you're not a babysitter," Ronan said. "I'm asking you to sit with my daughter because she trusts you, because you're the person she keeps asking about." He held Eli's gaze. "Will you do that?" It was not phrased as an order. It was phrased as what it was, a request, from a man who had too many things to manage, and one daughter who had spent the night in a back room of a clubhouse after being terrified in an alley, and who apparently had been asking for the boy who had stood between her and the people who'd scared her. "Yeah," Eli said. "Okay." He went through the back hallway. The room at the end was small and plain. A cot, a chair, a lamp on the floor throwing a warm, low circle of light, a child's drawing on the wall that someone had taped there, probably Sadie's own work, a house, and 2 figures in crayon that Eli tried not to look at too long. Sadie was sitting on the cot in her pink coat, still wearing it, apparently hadn't taken it off, with her knees pulled up and her hair in partial pigtails, one side still neat from whatever had been done to it yesterday morning, and one side completely undone. She had a coloring book open on her knees that Eli recognized as the one that had been scattered across the alley pavement the night before. Someone had collected it, and she was not coloring in it, just holding it. She looked up when he came in. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat in the chair. They looked at each other with the frank mutual assessment of people who had shared a very specific experience and were now figuring out what the shared experience made them to each other. "Does your face hurt?" she said. "Yes," he said. "My dad's face looks like that sometimes," she said. After bad things happen. Eli looked at the coloring book. Do you like coloring? Sometimes. She turned a page. I like drawing better, but I didn't have my drawing stuff last night. She looked at the crayon drawing on the wall. That one's old. I drew that when I was 5. What is it? My house, and my dad, and… She stopped, touched the edge of the paper. There were supposed to be 3 people, but I ran out of room. Eli looked at the drawing. 2 figures, one tall and one very small. A lot of space on the right side of the page that might have been empty or might have been waiting. Who was the third? He said. Sadie looked at him. She had her father's eyes, he realized. Not the color, which were lighter, but the quality of them. That direct collecting attention. My mom, she said simply. She's not here anymore, but when I drew it, I still thought she might come back. She looked down at the coloring book. She didn't. Eli said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. He knew the weight of that specific sentence. She didn't, because he had his own version of it, applied to different people, and he knew that what it needed was not a response, but just the willingness to sit in the same space with it, without flinching. Sadie seemed to know he understood something, even if she didn't know what. She turned another page. Are you going to stay? She said. He looked at her. Here, she clarified. With us. The question was asked with the directness of a 7-year-old, which was to say, without strategy, without the protective layering that adults put around questions they were afraid to ask. She just asked it, the way you asked if it was going to rain or whether the store was open. A real question that wanted a real answer. I don't know, Eli said. My dad wants you to, she said. He looked at her. He told you that. He didn't have to. She said it with the certainty of someone who had been reading her father for 7 years and had gotten very good at it. He gets a look, when he wants something to be a certain way. She turned a page in the coloring book, stopped at a picture of a horse in an open field. He had that look when he talked about you. Eli looked at the wall, at the space on the right side of the crayon drawing. He had been very careful, for 2 years, about not wanting things he couldn't have. It was a specific discipline that the street enforced. You excised the want before it could become a wound. You looked at warm windows from the outside, and you let them be warm windows, not something that was supposed to be available to you. You stayed mobile, stayed light, stayed unattached to anything that could be taken away. Because everything could be taken away, and the things you'd attached to hurt the worst when they went. He'd been in this building for less than 8 hours. He had no business wanting anything about it. The back hallway filled with sound. Not voices, footsteps, multiple sets, moving fast. Eli was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to stand, and Sadie looked up from the coloring book with eyes that had gone from calm to alert in a single second. Ronan opened the door. He took in Eli standing and Sadie on the cot, and the two of them looking at him, and his expression did a fast private thing before going neutral. We need to move, he said. He was talking to Eli. Something's changed. What changed? Reed didn't wait for morning, Ronan said. He started making calls at 6 a.m. 3 of our 8 compromised contacts have already been activated. He's calling in the debt simultaneously right now, all at once. He paused. And Cage's brother, the warehouse we identified in the Port District. One of our contacts there says there's been movement, people going in, more than usual for this time of morning. He's moving the brother, Eli said. We think so. If he moves him, we lose the leverage, Ronan said, and Cage loses his brother. He held Eli's gaze. I need to take people to that warehouse, which means this building is going to be short-staffed in the next 30 minutes. Dutch is staying, Deb is staying, 2 others. He paused. I need you to stay with Sadie. I thought you just said something changed, that I needed to… What changed is that I'm splitting my attention, Ronan said. I need Sadie with someone she trusts, and I need that someone to not be a liability if things go sideways inside this building. He looked at Eli directly. You're not a liability. You're 12, and you're hurt, and you've been awake most of the night, but you flag things, and you don't freeze, and my daughter trusts you. He paused. Dutch will be here. You won't be alone in the building, but I need to know that if something happens, you'll do what Dutch tells you. What could happen? Reed has 4 men on this block, Ronan said. If he decides this is the moment to apply pressure directly, they'll move on the building. That's not likely. He doesn't want the exposure of that. He prefers the financial pressure. But it's possible. He paused. If anything comes through that front door that Dutch didn't invite in, you take Sadie through the kitchen and out the back, and you don't stop. Sadie was listening to all of this. She was 7 years old, and she had the specific quality of a child who had grown up adjacent to difficult adult situations and had learned to hold herself very still in the middle of them. She was not crying. She was not panicking. She was watching her father with those collecting eyes and absorbing everything. "Dad," she said. Ronan looked at her. "Come back," she said. He crossed the room in 3 steps and crouched in front of her and put both hands on her face the same way he had in the alley, checking, confirming. He held her gaze. "I'll come back," he said. "I always come back." "I know," she said. "Come back anyway." Something in his face did what it had done in the alley. That brief private collapse. The one he didn't show the room. The one that belonged only to her. Then it went solid. He stood. He looked at Eli. "Whatever I said last night," Eli said, "about wanting to know the truth, about whether this is something." He held Ronan's gaze. "You can tell me when you get back." Ronan looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I will." He went out. The hallway swallowed his footsteps, and then the building swallowed those, and outside, through the walls, through the corrugated metal and the cold January air. The sound of multiple Harleys starting came through like something felt rather than heard, a vibration that started in the floor and moved upward. Sadie listened to it. Her face was turned slightly toward the wall, toward the sound, the way a person turned toward something they were tracking without wanting to watch directly. Eli sat back down in the chair. They sat together in the small room with the lamp and the crayon drawing and the coloring book, and the engines outside built to a collective roar and then diminished as the convoy pulled out. And the silence that came after was thick and specific, the silence of a building that had just lost most of its occupants. "Tell me something," Sadie said. "What?" "Anything." She looked at him. "Just talk. It's better when someone's talking." He understood that. He'd learned it himself in different circumstances. The specific way silence in a bad situation amplified everything wrong, and the way a voice, any words at all, pushed the walls back slightly and gave you something to hold on to. "Okay," he said. He thought about what he had to tell, what stories he carried that were his to give. He thought about his grandmother's kitchen, which was the last warm place he'd lived that was warm because someone made it warm, not just because there was heat. He thought about the way she made coffee by boiling it on the stove instead of using the machine, because she said the machine made it taste like the inside of a plastic cup. He thought about sitting on her counter while she cooked, which she allowed even though every adult after her had told him to get off the counter, and watching the steam come off the pots and the smell of it. He started to talk. Not about any of the things from last night, not about Reed or Cage or the 40-hour clock, or the warehouse in the port district where Ronan was going right now, in the cold morning air with his men and his engines and whatever was waiting for him there. He talked about his grandmother's kitchen, about the coffee, about the counter, about the way the steam looked. Sadie listened with her knees pulled up and her coloring book closed on the cot beside her, and after a few minutes her shoulders came down from where they'd been, up around her ears, braced, the posture of a child who had been holding herself together by willpower. And she leaned slightly against the wall and just listened. The building was quiet around them. Dutch's boots on the wooden floor somewhere in the front of the building, the occasional low voice, the cold morning outside doing its cold morning things. And then, at 9:17 by Eli's reckoning, Dutch's voice from the front of the building, sharp, controlled, a single word that Eli didn't catch, but whose register he caught perfectly, because it was the register of someone who had just received information they had been hoping not to receive. Eli stopped talking. Sadie looked at him. He stood. He moved to the door, opened it a crack, listened. Dutch was on a phone. His back was to the hallway. His free hand was pressed flat against the wall in front of him, and the hand was pressing hard, the knuckles going light against the skin, the specific body language of a man absorbing something through physical contact with a surface, because the alternative was letting it come through him unchecked. Eli heard 3 words before Dutch turned and saw the crack of the open door, and his expression shut down into something that told Eli everything about the next few minutes. The 3 words were, they were waiting. Eli closed the door, turned back to Sadie. She was looking at him with her father's eyes, that gray, direct, already knowing attention, and she said nothing because she already understood from the quality of his face that something had gone wrong, and she was 7 years old and she'd grown up adjacent to difficult situations, and she knew how to read a room. "Come here," Eli said. He moved to her and she came off the cot, and he put himself between her and the door, not because he'd decided to, not because he'd calculated it, because that was where he stood. Because somewhere in the warehouse district of Mill Haven, on a cold January morning with the rain just passed and the streets still wet, Ronan Voss had ridden directly into something Danny Reed had been prepared for, and the men on Crane Street outside were still in position, and the building was down to Dutch, and two others, and Deb and a 12-year-old boy who had never in his life been anything but invisible and alone. And whoever came through the front door of this building in the next few minutes would find, if they got past Dutch, exactly what they found in the alley the night before. A boy who should have run, who hadn't, who was still standing in the only place that made sense to him, between the danger and the person who needed him there. Dutch came through the door 30 seconds later. He didn't knock. He opened it the way people opened doors in situations where knocking was a luxury they didn't have, and he took in Eli standing between the door and Sadie with an expression that did a single fast thing before going professional. "We need to move," he said. "What happened?" Eli said. Ronan walked into a setup. Dutch's voice was even, controlled. The specific control of the man who had been in bad situations before and had learned that the way you sounded in them mattered. "Reed had people already at the warehouse. 4 of ours are down. Not dead, hurt. Ronan's contained. They're holding the building." The room was very cold suddenly, despite the lamp. "Cage's brother," Eli said. "Was never there," Dutch said. "The location Cole gave us was—" He stopped. "Either Cole lied or Reed moved him before we got there. We don't know which yet." Sadie made a sound behind Eli, small, controlled. The sound of a child absorbing information she was too young to have to absorb and doing it anyway because the alternative was not available to her. "What do we do?" Eli said. Dutch looked at him. In the lamplight, with the crayon drawing on the wall behind him and the coloring book on the cot, Dutch looked older than he had in the main room. Older in a way that was not about age, but about the particular weight of a man who had been the person responsible for knowing what to do in too many situations like this one. "We have 6 men not at the warehouse," Dutch said. 3 here, 3 more I can call in from the north side, who can be here in 20 minutes. He paused. "Reed's 4 men are still on the street outside. They haven't moved, which means Reed is using them as a perimeter. He doesn't want us leaving, and he doesn't want information getting out, but he's not moving on the building directly." Another pause. "Yet. He wants something," Eli said. "He wouldn't have set the trap at the warehouse if he just wanted to hurt people. He'd have done that already. He wants something specific." Dutch looked at him with that considering expression he'd used several times over the last few hours, the one that seemed to be recalibrating something. "Mason," he said, "Reed wants his son back." "And Ronan," Eli said. "He wants Ronan contained because Ronan is the problem. The club is the problem, but Ronan is the problem that holds the club together." He thought about what Cole had said, about the machine Reed was building, about the territory. If he holds Ronan, he can negotiate. He can make Ronan call off the club in exchange for his own release and get everything he wants without anyone having to do anything that creates exposure. Dutch stared at him. "I'm 12, Eli said. "Not stupid." "I know," Dutch said. "That's why I'm letting you talk." "So what's the play?" Dutch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Reed doesn't know everything Cole told us. He knows Cole came here. He probably knows Cole talked. But he doesn't know how much, and he doesn't know what we've done with it." He paused. "We've been making contact with the 8 compromised parties since 5 this morning. 3 of them had already been activated by Reed, like Ronan said. But 5 of them, we reached first, before Reed made his call. So 5 of them know the debt is being handled," Dutch said. "Yes. We started making arrangements as soon as Cole gave us the list. Ronan's been moving money since before he left for the warehouse." A pause. "Reed's leverage campaign is already half collapsed. He just doesn't know it yet." Eli thought about this. "He's going to find out when he makes the calls. He's probably making them right now. which means the window where he thinks he has the advantage is closing, Dutch said. And when it closes, the equation changes. Reed is not a man who makes good decisions under pressure. Cole told us that. He plans well, but he reacts badly. Dutch straightened. We have a window, small, but real. What do you need? Eli said. Dutch looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Sadie, who was standing very still by the cot, watching both of them. Mason Reed is in the back room, Dutch said. He's been there all night. He knows his father has been making moves. He's not stupid either. He heard things. He's not as isolated as we let him think. He paused. What he doesn't know is that his father just trapped Ronan in a warehouse and is using it as a bargaining chip. Another pause. He doesn't know that the man who chose not to hurt him last night is currently contained by his father's people. You want to tell him, Eli said. I want someone to talk to him, Dutch said. Not me. Not any of mine. Someone he doesn't have a reason to distrust on sight. He met Eli's gaze. Someone his own age who was in that alley last night. Someone who knows what it felt like when Ronan had every reason to respond with violence and chose something different. You want me to convince him to call his father? I want you to tell him the truth, Dutch said, and see what he does with it. Eli looked at the floor. He thought about the alley, about the tall boy who had lifted him off the ground, who had hit him more times than he'd counted. He thought about what it meant to sit across from that person and say, the man your father is hurting right now is a better man than your father. He thought about being 17 and hearing that, about what it would do to you. He thought about what Ronan had said about Mason in the main room. He didn't want him broken. He wanted him to understand. Okay, he said. Dutch nodded. He looked at Sadie. You're going to stay with Heck in the main room. You're going to sit at the table and you're going to drink whatever Deb puts in front of you, and you're not going to move until I come back. Where are you going? Sadie said. To make some calls, Dutch said, and then to go get your father. Sadie looked at him. She nodded once. The motion was very adult, the specific nod of someone who had decided to hold themselves together because the situation required it, not because they weren't afraid. Dutch took her to the main room. Eli followed the hallway the other direction, to the room at the end where Mason Reed had spent the night. The room was a storage space converted into something marginally more humane, a cot, a lamp, a chair, the door not locked, but with a man outside it who had been there all night. The man stepped aside when Eli approached and did not comment on the fact that the person being sent in was 12 years old and visibly beaten up. Mason was awake. He was sitting on the cot with his back against the wall and his knees up, wearing the same jacket from the alley, and he looked different than he'd looked in the alley. In the alley, he had been the architecture of a threat. Here he looked like a 17-year-old who had not slept and who had spent the night in a small room listening to the sounds of a building that had slowly shifted from busy to quiet to busy again, with no information about why. He looked at Eli when the door opened. He took in the closed eye, the butterfly closures, the jacket that was too big for its wearer. Neither of them spoke for a moment. You're the kid from the alley, Mason said. Yes, Eli said. You look worse. You should see the other guy. Eli looked at him. That was a joke. I don't have another guy. You were the other guy. Something moved through Mason's face. Not quite amusement, something adjacent to it and more complicated. Eli came in and sat in the chair. Mason watched him do it. What do you want? Mason said. To tell you something, Eli said. You can do what you want with it. That's what people say before they tell you something they want you to do something specific with. Fair, Eli said, but I'm still going to tell you. He told him. All of it. Not everything, not the internal operational details, but the shape of it. The warehouse. The setup. Ronan contained. Reed's leverage campaign and the fact that half of it had already collapsed before he'd started making calls. He told it plainly, without editorializing, the way he'd learned to relay information on the street, accurate, fast, without inflection, because inflection was a form of pressure, and pressure made people defensive and defensive. People didn't hear what you were actually saying. Mason listened. His face did things during the telling, controlled things he was working to keep controlled, but the work was visible if you knew how to look. When Eli stopped, Mason was quiet for a long time. My father had men at that warehouse, he said finally. Before last night. Yes. He knew his son was here and he set a trap anyway. Eli said nothing. That was Mason's conclusion to reach, not Eli's to hand him. Mason looked at the wall. His jaw was working. He wouldn't have known I'd be here. He didn't plan it around me. He planned it around. He stopped. Around the situation, Eli said. Yeah. He would have figured I'd be released, Mason said. That's how he'd have calculated it. They were never going to hold me. They'd use me to make a point, and then he stopped again. The sentence had hit something on its way out, and he'd caught it. Eli could see him catching it. He used you, Eli said. Not cruelly, just clearly. Not intentionally. But the way the plan worked, you were a piece of it whether you knew it or not. Your being here triggered the timeline. Don't, Mason's voice went sharp, then came back down. Don't explain my father to me. I'm not, Eli said. I'm just telling you what I know. What you do with it is your thing. Another long silence. The man who has Ronan contained right now, Mason said. How many people? We don't have a full count. What's the address? Eli looked at him. The warehouse, Mason said. What's the address? Why? Mason looked at him with an expression that was working through something in real time, something that had not finished resolving, something that might not finish resolving for years, but that had reached a moment where the unresolved thing required action regardless. Because my father answers his phone when I call, he said, and because he stopped, pressed his mouth together. Because the man in charge of this club sat in front of me last night and chose something different, and I'm not. Another stop. The sentence was fighting him. I've seen what my father chooses. I've been watching it my whole life, and I know which one of those things I want to be. Eli held his gaze for a moment. Then he stood and went to the door and opened it and said the address to the man outside who knew it, and the man said it back to Mason, and Mason took out a phone that had apparently not been taken from him, an oversight, or perhaps a deliberate choice Eli would understand later, and made a call. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Eli heard only Mason's side of it. He heard the particular quality of a son talking to a father in a way he'd probably never talked to him before. Not with anger, which was the language of people who still believed they could change the other person, but with the flat and final register of someone who had decided something and was communicating the decision. He heard Mason say, "Let him go." He heard him say, "Because I'm asking you to." He heard him say, after a long silence on the other end, "Because if you don't, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure everyone knows exactly how you built what you built. Not a threat. A fact." Another long silence from the other end. Then Mason hung up. He sat for a moment with the phone in his hands. He looked at Eli. "He'll pull his men back," he said. "From the warehouse and from this street." He paused. "He won't stop. He'll regroup and he'll try something else eventually. But not today." "Your father's going to know you did this," Eli said. "I know." "What happens to you?" Mason looked at the wall. "I don't know," he said. He said it without drama, without self-pity. The specific honesty of someone who had looked at the actual question and given the actual answer. "But I know what happens if I don't." He looked at Eli. "You protected her," he said. "The little girl. You kept getting up." "Yes." "I had 60 pounds on you." "I know." "Why?" Mason said. And it was the same question Ronan had asked in the alley, but it sounded different in this room from this person. It sounded like someone asking a question that was also about themselves. "Because somebody had to," Eli said, "and I was the one who was there." Mason held his gaze. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Okay." What happened in the next 2 hours happened fast, and then slow, and then fast again. Dutch's calls brought 3 men from the north side who arrived within 20 minutes and took up positions. Reed's people on the street, the gray pickup, the man with the coffee, the staged car, pulled away within 35 minutes of Mason's call, one at a time, without incident, the way water receded. Nobody chased them. Nobody tried to stop them. Dutch watched from the window and said nothing when the last car turned the corner and was gone. The convoy came back from the warehouse at 8:43 in the morning. Eli heard it before he saw it, that collective low vibration, building from somewhere east, growing, the sound of multiple engines moving together that he'd heard for the first time in the alley the night before. He was in the main room with Sadie when it started, and Sadie came off her chair and was at the door before Dutch could intercept her. And Dutch let her go, which said everything about what he knew was coming. The bikes came down Crane Street in a formation that was not precise or performative. It was the formation of people who rode together so often that the arrangement happened without coordination. Ronan was at the front. He had a cut on his cheek that was going to need closing, and he was favoring his left shoulder, and his jacket had something dark on the sleeve that was not grease, but he was upright on the bike and he was riding, and he turned onto the lot and cut the engine and was off the bike, in a motion that absorbed the wince it cost him before it reached his face. Sadie ran across the lot. He caught her. Both arms, no hesitation, the impact of a 7-year-old running at full speed absorbed without staggering, and he held her with his face pressed into her hair and his eyes closed, and his left arm doing something that was clearly painful and clearly irrelevant to him. Eli stood in the doorway and watched. The rest of the convoy came in around them, engines cutting one by one, men dismounting, some of them carrying the specific careful quality of people who had absorbed physical damage and were managing it with the practiced restraint of people who were very good at not showing it. Eli counted. 4 men were not on bikes. They came in a truck that pulled up behind the convoy, 2 of them walking in under their own power with visible difficulty, 2 helped in by others. Not dead. Dutch had said not dead. He'd been right. Ronan looked up over Sadie's shoulder and found Eli in the doorway. He held his gaze for a moment, then carried Sadie inside, and the building filled back up with the men who had been in it the night before, and the sounds and the warmth of them. And Deb moved through it with the specific efficient care of someone who knew which wounds needed attending first and in what order. Cole was still in the building. He'd been in the back all morning, and when the convoy came back, he appeared in the main room doorway with the expression of a man who didn't know whether to take up space or disappear, and Dutch looked at him for a moment, and Cole looked at Dutch. And what passed between them was not forgiveness, which was a much larger and longer process, but something more immediate. You stayed. You told the truth. We're still standing. Cole nodded. Dutch looked away. Cage was the last one through the door. He came in from the truck, walking on his own, with a bruise across his left jaw that was going to be spectacular by evening. He stood in the main room and looked at the floor, and then looked up at Ronan. Ronan looked at him for a long moment. Your brother, Ronan said. We found him. Cage went completely still. How was at the warehouse, Ronan said. Different room. Reed moved him there when he moved his operations 3 weeks ago. Cole had old information. He paused. He's okay. He's in the truck. Cage looked at the door. Back at Ronan. Something in his face was moving through too many things too fast for any of them to fully surface. Go, Ronan said. Cage went. The sound that came from the parking lot a moment later was not something that required interpretation. Eli stood by the wall and watched the room breathe and settle around this new reality. The men who were hurt being attended to, the men who weren't making coffee and handing it to the ones who were, the low exchange of information, the shorthand of people who had been through something together and were now processing it in the way that people who didn't have good words for their feelings process things, which was through presence and proximity and the small practical acts of taking care. Ronan crossed to him. He was carrying Sadie in the crook of his right arm, which was the arm that didn't hurt, and he stood in front of Eli and looked at him with that gray, direct gaze. Mason made the call, Eli said. I know, Dutch told me. He paused. How? I told him the truth, Eli said. You didn't hurt him when you had every reason to. I told him that. He looked at the floor. He made the rest of it himself. Ronan was quiet for a moment. You told me last night to tell you the truth when I got back. Eli looked up. I'm going to need some time to do this right, Ronan said. There are legal things. There are processes. His voice was careful, not distancing. The specific care of someone who had thought about something seriously and wanted to be accurate. But I want you here. Not for what you can do. Not because of last night. He held Eli's gaze. Because of the kind of person you are. And because you deserve to be somewhere. He paused. If that's something you want. Eli looked at him. At Sadie on his arm, who was watching Eli with her father's eyes, and not saying anything for once, because she was 7 years old and she understood somehow that this was a moment that needed to be quiet. He thought about the Mercer Street grate, the garbage bag pad, the wool blanket from the drop box. He thought about the discipline of not wanting things you couldn't have, which he had practiced for 2 years until it was almost automatic, until it ran underneath everything like a current, like weather. He thought about the space on the right side of the crayon drawing. Yeah, he said. His voice was not steady. He let it be not steady. That's something I want. Ronan nodded. He extended his right hand, the arm with Sadie on it, so it was an awkward angle. So the handshake that resulted was not a smooth or elegant thing. It was slightly sideways, slightly complicated by a 7-year-old who shifted her weight at the wrong moment, and Ronan made a brief sound that was almost a laugh, the first one Eli had heard from him, short and real, and surprised out of him by the situation. Eli felt something happen in his chest, something he hadn't felt for long enough that he didn't have a current name for it. The closest he could get was this right here. The awkward handshake, the weight of a real answer to a real question, the warm room with the neon signs and the wood stove and the men who took care of each other in the specific graceless way of people who didn't have the words for it, but had the actions. This. Mason Reed left the clubhouse at noon, walked by Dutch to the end of the block, and from there made whatever choices belonged to him. Dutch watched him go and said nothing. Eli watched from the window. Mason walked without looking back, which was either the posture of someone who had put something behind them or someone who didn't trust themselves to look back if they were going to keep going forward. Eli decided it was probably both. Danny Reed did not regroup quickly. The collapse of 5 of his 8 leverage positions in a single morning before he'd activated them, before they'd had value, damaged the architecture of his campaign in ways that couldn't be repaired on a short timeline. Cole gave a full account to people whose job it was to receive such accounts, and what Reed had built over 18 months began to be dismantled by people with the institutional authority to do it. It was slow. It was imperfect. It did not have the clean arc of a story where the villain received exactly what he deserved in a single cathartic moment. What it had was attrition and accountability and the specific grinding process of systems that moved slowly but eventually moved. Cage's situation was handled the way Ronan handled most things. Not quickly, not loudly, not with a clean resolution that satisfied every party completely. There was a period of time where Cage was not at the table in the main room, where things between him and the men he'd compromised moved through several difficult phases that were not resolved in a single conversation or a single gesture. What Cage had done had cost people, had nearly cost Ronan, specifically, more than he would say directly. And the cost did not disappear because the reasons for it were understandable. But Cage's brother was alive, and Cage was still in the building, and both of those things had a trajectory, even if the trajectory was slow. Cole stayed in Millhaven. He had nowhere else to go, and more practically, he had information that was useful to the people in the process of dismantling what Reed had built. He was not part of the club. He was not folded in with the easy trust that none of them had extended to each other quickly or cheaply. But Dutch talked to him, and occasionally Dutch and Cole were seen at the table in the main room with coffee and a map, discussing something in the low specific tones of people working a problem together. That was what it was. Deb enrolled Eli in school. That was how it happened. Not a ceremony, not a significant conversation, just Deb appearing one morning with paperwork and saying, "Here, I need your signature on this," and Eli looking at the paperwork and understanding that it represented a decision that had already been made, not by him and not entirely without him, in the way that some decisions got made in a family, which was through the accumulated weight of smaller decisions that had all been pointing the same direction. He went to the school. It was strange. It was full of people his age who had entirely different relationships with the concept of danger, with the concept of survival, with the concept of what a morning looked like. He sat in classes and he was not good at some things and was surprisingly good at others. And the teachers had various reactions to him that ranged from concerned to confused to, in one case, genuinely interested in the specific way his brain worked, which nobody had been before. He came back to the clubhouse in the afternoons. It was 3 weeks after everything before he stopped checking the exits when he walked into a room. He noticed the stopping, noticed the morning he walked into the main room and got his coffee and sat at the table and looked at the door and the windows with the frank appraisal of someone deciding they were in a safe space, not someone deciding which way to run. He sat with that for a moment. The coffee was hot. Dutch was at the far table reading something. The wood stove was going. Sadie was at school. He still carried things. He would carry them for a long time, in the way that people carried things that had happened in the years before they had enough ground under their feet to process them. Not as open wounds exactly, but as weight, as texture, as the particular shape their hands made when they were thinking about something they weren't saying. He would have to learn, slowly and with various degrees of difficulty, what it meant to be in a place where that weight was allowed to exist without requiring him to perform in vulnerability. That was not a quick education. It was not a clean one. There were nights when the storage room felt like exactly what it was, a small space in an unfamiliar building, and the warmth of it was not enough to cover the distance between where he was and where he was supposed to have been. The home that had existed when his grandmother was alive. The ordinary childhood he'd been rotating toward before the system caught him and did what systems did. But there were other nights. Nights when the main room was full of men eating food that Deb had made and arguing about something trivial and laughing in the abrupt, graceless way that people laughed when they were genuinely caught off guard by something funny. And Sadie was doing her homework at the big table and periodically asking Dutch to explain math in a way that he clearly found perplexing, and the wood stove was going, and outside the Harleys sat in the lot under the security light with that particular look of things that were resting and would be moving again soon. On one of those nights, late, when Sadie had been put to bed and most of the men had gone to wherever they went, Ronan came and sat across from Eli at the table. He didn't say anything for a while. He had the cut on his cheek and the shoulder that was taking its time healing and the general worn quality of a man who had been handling too many things at once for too long, which was, Eli was coming to understand, simply what he looked like, what he always looked like, the cost of being the thing that held everything together. "You okay?" Ronan said. "Yes," Eli said. He thought about it. "Getting there." Ronan nodded. "Can I ask you something?" Eli said. "Yes." "The night in the alley, when you came in." He looked at the table. "How long were you—" He stopped. Started again. "How long had she been missing?" Ronan was quiet for a moment. His hands were around his coffee mug, both of them, the way Eli had held his own mug that first night when the warmth of it was something he hadn't been able to take for granted. 40 minutes, Ronan said. "From the time I got the call to the time I found her." He paused. "Longest 40 minutes I've had since her mother died." Eli looked at him. At the man across the table. The man whose name made certain parts of the city go quiet, who had built something in this building out of people who didn't fit anywhere else, who had made a choice in an alley about what justice looked like, and had applied it consistently, even when the cost of applying it consistently was high. "She's going to be okay," Eli said. "Sadie." "I know," Ronan said. "She's tough." "She gets it from somewhere," Ronan said. There was something in his voice on that, just the smallest thing, a slight pressure under the words. And Eli understood that Ronan was not talking about himself, was probably not talking about her mother either, but was talking about the quality itself, the fact of it, wherever it came from, the way some people were built to bend without breaking, and that was its own kind of inheritance. They sat together in the quiet room. The fire ticked. The neon signs threw their colors across the old wood floor. Outside, somewhere distant, several blocks, maybe more, a single motorcycle moved through the dark city, the sound of it rising and then fading, the way things moved through Millhaven's streets at night, purposeful and brief and gone before you could fully register what you'd heard. Eli wrapped both hands around his mug. The coffee was hot. The room was warm. Somewhere in the back, Sadie was sleeping in the room with the crayon drawing on the wall. The house. The two figures. The space on the right side of the page that had been waiting. He thought about that space, about what it meant that it had been there before any of this, drawn by a 5-year-old who had run out of room, or who had left room, or who had simply known that the picture wasn't finished yet. He thought about the alley, about the scatter of toys across wet pavement and the sound that had reached him when he could have been asleep and wasn't, about the cold, about the specific moment when his body had moved before his fear could stop it, which was not bravery exactly. He'd thought about that enough now to know it wasn't bravery, which was something you felt, but was something more like the absence of a reason not to. He had not had anything to lose. That was what people said about situations like that. Nothing to lose. But that wasn't right, wasn't accurate. He'd had exactly what he'd always had. himself. His 63 pounds and his 2 years of street education and the wool blanket smell and the hands that knew how to read a room without appearing to. He'd had himself. And he'd put that between the girl and the danger. And now he was here. Family isn't about who shares your blood, Ronan had said that first night, and Eli had turned the sentence over many times since then, wearing it down like a stone in water until what was left was the shape of what it actually meant, which was simpler and harder than the words. It's about who stays when things get ugly. They had stayed. He had stayed. That was the whole of it. That was the mechanism. Not a grand decision, not a moment of transformation, just the repeated accumulation of small choices to remain, to be present, to be honest, to be the person who stood in the space between the danger and the person who needed someone standing there. He was still learning how. He expected he would be for a long time. Outside, Millhaven was doing what it did on winter nights, cold and indifferent and full of people who had no idea what had happened in this building over the last several weeks, and probably didn't need to. The alley behind the Rusty Nail Diner was just an alley. The Mercer Street grate was just a grate. The city was the city it had always been, vast and unmoved and proceeding without regard for any single person's story. But in the main room of a building on Crane Street, with neon light on old wood floors and a wood stove that had been going for 30 years and a table that had held 10,000 cups of coffee and the weight of 10,000 conversations that didn't have clean endings, a boy who had been nobody sat across from a man who had found him in the dark and decided to look. The coffee was hot. The room was warm. He had somewhere to return to. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough. And in the morning, in all the mornings that came after, with their complications and their costs, and the slow, difficult work of learning to trust a world that had given him every reason not to, that would still be true. He had somewhere to return